The President of the United States, Joe Biden, addressed the United Nations General Assembly today. This was his second speech at the United Nations. Biden began his speech by condemning Russia's war in Ukraine. He said one man, Vladimir Putin, was responsible for this war, adding that Putin was intent on wiping Ukraine off the map.
In the last year, our world has experienced great upheaval. A growing crisis in food insecurity, record heat, floods and droughts, COVID-19, inflation, and a brutal, needless war. A war chosen by one man, to be very blunt. Let us speak plainly. A permanent member of the United Nations Security Council invaded its neighbor, attempted to erase a sovereign state from the map. Russia has shamelessly violated the core tenets of the United Nations Charter. No more important than the clear prohibition against countries taking the territory of their neighbor by force.
The President also emphasized on the United Nations Charter, which was signed after the Second World War. The Charter guarantees principles like sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Last year,
Biden says that the United States will continue to support and even stand by Ukraine. He also called for a just end to the war based on Ukraine's demands. President Biden further rebutted claims made by Vladimir Putin on Tuesday. He said that no country threatened Russia's security and that this war was an act of unprovoked aggression. He called on all members of the United Nations to hold Russia accountable. The United States President spent most of his time speaking about the war in Ukraine, but he also touched upon the issue of United Nations reforms. Biden asked permanent members of the Security Council to use the veto power more sparingly. He also supported its expansion to include more permanent and non-permanent members, including those from Africa. The United Nations Security Council is composed of 5 permanent members with veto rights: China, France, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. There are also 10 non-permanent members elected by the UNGA. The question of reforming the United Nations Security Council has raised or was raised by nations like India for a long time. But this is the first time in years that the United States says it wants to expand the Council. This is because of Russia and China's presence on the Council.
I also believe the time has come for this institution to become more inclusive so that it can better respond to the needs of today's world. Members of the UN Security Council, including the United States, should consistently uphold and defend the UN Charter and refrain from the use of the veto, except in rare, extraordinary situations, to ensure that the Council remains credible and effective. That is also why the United States supports increasing the number of both permanent and non-permanent representatives of the Council. This includes permanent seats for those nations we have long supported and permanent seats for countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. The United States is committed to this vital work.
Biden also highlighted issues like global food security, the necessity to fund the fight against pandemics, supply chain problems, and the climate crisis. He touted United States investments to fight the climate crisis, including $369 billion funds to battle climate change. Biden also talked about the rising U.S.-China tensions in the Taiwan Strait, adding that the United States does not seek a Cold War or conflict with China. Biden also stressed that Washington will not call on countries to choose between the United States and other partners.
As we manage shifting geopolitical trends, the United States will conduct itself as a reasonable leader. We do not seek conflict. We do not seek a Cold War. We do not ask any nation to choose between the United States or any other partner. But the United States will be unabashed in promoting our vision of a free, open, secure, and prosperous world.
President Biden also addressed the protests that are raging across Iran, saying that the United States stands with the women of Iran. He also reiterated his stance that the United States will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. This as negotiations to revive a nuclear deal have failed to make progress.
And nations such as the nation of Iran, in the realization of their aspiration for the Islamic Revolution, has strengthened in the heart of the people around the globe such aspirations. The Islamic Revolution of Iran was the realization of the movement of the people.
Well, joining us live from the United Nations headquarters in New York is WION correspondent Susan Teherani. Hi, Susan. As expected, President Biden lashed out at Russia over its invasion of Ukraine, saying that Putin has violated the United Nations Charter. What did you read from the president's mood and the delivery at the United Nations Forum?
Yeah, President Biden was adamant to really bring home the notion and the condemnation regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and for other countries to not get any crazy ideas either. On the one hand, as we explained prior to his speech, and as anticipated, he really brought home the idea that democracy at the end of the day prevails over autocracy and dictatorships. And, you know, let's not forget that his speech did follow that of shortly after Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi, who was very hard-hitting against the United States and the West as well. He talked about the countries that he wants to reach common grounds with, those who do follow the UN Charter. He said that countries cannot just walk in and violate other countries through bloodshed, and if you are going to abide by the UN Charter, then we're willing to work with you. Again, you know, really talking about Russia and the invasion as well. It was interesting that he was joined by John Kerry and Anthony Blinken, John Kerry being his climate czar, Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State. That's no surprise. But, you know, John Kerry being there, sitting there next to Blinken, really also highlights how important the issue of climate is for this president. And we saw that not only addressing it regarding COP26, but then he said, you know, the United States is taking steps at home as well, adhering to $360 billion, signing a climate change bill. Right. And I just want to say, it's interesting that when the president of the United States is here, in the United States, in the United Nations, he does say that his climate bill is regarding the climate, but when he addresses a domestic audience, he calls it the Reduction Act, and so, you know, it's all depends on the audience that he's addressing, you know, so. You know, that was really an interesting policy nugget to adhere to. It's the same bill. It is regarding climate. But when he talks to his audience at home, he likes to talk about the economy and how it's going to make their lives easier regarding the Inflation Reduction Act.
Choice of words indeed. Focus was mainly on the war in Ukraine, the food crisis, the pandemic. What else was highlighted by the president and was key about the United States agenda?
Yeah, okay. And as you mentioned, you know, those were very important issues, the issue of food insecurity that he had to talk about because he had to, again, justify how much the West and the United States is backing Ukraine regarding Russia's invasion. And countries are facing insecurity and food insecurity and energy insecurity because of this war, and the United States and its allies are obviously taking sides. He also talked about how the United Nations Security Council must be reformed now. And I think it was interesting that he actually talked about how it should be more inclusive. Let's not forget that countries, including India, have time and again for years talked about this reform at the Security Council and how it's absolutely ridiculous in this point in time that only 5 members have veto-wielding power. He said that the issue of veto has to be, you know, it shouldn't be so heavy-handed on the one hand. And then he also talked about increasing permanent and non-permanent members of the Security Council as well. So, you know, that's something that's doable. He put it at the forefront, and it was interesting that it was part of his speech. He talked about the issue of human rights and multilateralism. He is a multilateral president. That's something that did stand out as well. But then, you know, he talked about the supply chain issue as well. He was very clear to talk directly to Iran and say, well, diplomacy is the only path.
Right.
We will not allow, quote, we will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. So that was very important as well.
Live from New York, WION correspondent Susan Teherani, thank you. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.